trauma, PTSD, trust, safety, our inner needs, what we desire and what we want out of our life and our relationships is exactly what we're talking about in today's podcast episode on the Happiness Happens podcast. My name is Simona. I'm the host of the show, and I'm so grateful to have you back here with me today. My guest today is Dr. Tim Lewis, and he's a licensed clinical psychologist who's been treating people living with complex trauma and PTSD for 14 years. Dr. Lewis earned his master's and doctoral degrees in clinical psychology from the Wright Institute in Berkeley, California. He's a member of the San Francisco Psychotherapy Research Group and past board member of the San Francisco Psychological Association. As a trauma survivor and writer, Dr. Lewis brings a unique blend of science, art, philosophy, and personal experience to help his clients heal from old wounds and find joy and fulfillment. He was raised in Kansas City, and he now lives with his husband and his daughter in a forest filled with giant redwoods near San Francisco. You're going to love our conversation today because we talked about the impact of trauma and how trauma and PTSD show up in our lives in very different ways and in ways that we may not typically expect. We talked a lot about developing that self-trust and understanding our abandonment wound. And this conversation was just very validating for my own self. And I know it's going to be very powerful for you to listen to as well. So if you like what you hear, be sure to leave a 5-star rating of the podcast, tag someone on social media that you know needs to hear this message, and share this episode with them so we can spread the word to more people. Because honestly, that is how we get the word out there about the Happiness Happens podcast and to continue to grow our community and grow our collective to make a serious and significant impact in the world. I am just beaming sharing this conversation with you because Dr. Lewis sincerely put everything so eloquently and so beautifully. You'll also hear a little bit about his book. We talk about it towards the end of the episode. His book is called Daddy, and it is now available for order wherever you get your books. You can check out the link in the show notes for that as well. And I hope that you grab a copy of it because the story is very unique. His story is very empowering, and I know that you are going to gain a lot from our time together today. So thank you for being here with me. Now let's get into our conversation. Dr. Tim, welcome to the Happiness Happens podcast. I'm very excited to have you on the show today.
Oh, great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I want to start out our conversation today. I've been asking this question at the beginning of every podcast episode because everyone has such a different definition of happiness, but I would love to know what happiness means to you.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot too this morning in preparation for our talk. And my thoughts are really informed by somebody called Martin Seligman. He's a psychologist. He started the positive psychology movement back in the 1990s. He's done a lot of research on positive states of emotion, and he makes a critical distinction between happiness and well-being. I subscribe to the well-being definition of happiness, if you will. Happiness, he talks about as being linked to really those highs, those moments where you're out there having a great time, engaging in kind of bucket list activities, things you've always wanted to do, maybe bungee jumping. And I think of well-being, and he talks about it in terms of more positive emotional states that are kind of broader than I think most people's constricted understanding of happiness. And well-being relates to experiences that are sustainable, that you cultivate throughout life. And you cultivate those through different activities. We all have certain strengths. And so engaging in what he calls character strengths creates a sense of flow, a sense of really being in the moment, kind of those times when you lose yourself. And I think our strengths are very different. Mine is helping to educate people, to provide therapy. I love nurturing people in my life. That's very gratifying. And I can find myself losing, an hour and I look up, that sense where you look up and suddenly an hour's gone by. I think of that as well-being. I think of that as the state that I try to cultivate, as we define in general as happiness.
Okay, that's a really interesting distinction. I've never actually heard it broken down that way. And when I first started doing this podcast, it was about 4 years ago now, I first came across positive psychology. And I thought the concepts of positive psychology were so interesting to me because I felt like they looked at the whole person as opposed to just one specific thing. So I know your work is in trauma and is in PTSD, and that's how you help people. And I want to hear a little bit more about your story as well. And we're going to talk about your book too, because I think it's really important to shed light on all these different pieces. And what I think is so interesting is that a lot of the times, and you let me know what your thoughts are about this, but a lot of the times I feel like we can look at one specific thing. Like if I go to my doctor and they tell me that I have anxiety, they're looking at the one specific thing, whereas we're not always getting to the root cause of the feeling that's behind that, or the trigger that's behind that, or the lived experience that adds to that emotion. And so do you find that sometimes we mask all of these different feelings that we have, and in some way that impacts our overall well-being?
What do you mean by masking
So
exactly?
no, it's a good clarification. So, sometimes if we're just treating the main, what's presenting as the main challenge, instead of going into the specific symptoms and circumstances, you know what I mean?
Right.
And through that lens, do you feel that our well-being is impacted if we're not digging deep and understanding the core of that feeling or emotion, or feeling or emotion that we're living in?
Absolutely. People, often start treatment with me and want their anxiety to go away
Yeah.
because I'm so anxious. I can't feel happy. I'm worried all the time. And there's this very, very understandable wish that they, were built with this off switch that we can attack this one symptom, anxiety,
Mm.
and shut it off with these 5 steps. And there are some steps out there that will help, but like you said, it does go deeper. And I think happiness, as I define it, and well-being are connected to really daily self-care that is broad-based, like you're saying, that looks at the whole person. The basics like diet, exercise, sleep are the building blocks. And you need to have those things in place to ever have a hope of being able to have those states of positive experience, and even those flashes of happiness that show up sometimes at unexpected times.
That's really, really interesting to me because I feel like, I've been talking about happiness on this podcast for a while now. And it's, everyone defines it by something different, of course. And for myself, I define happiness as inner peace. But how do you get that inner peace is through the exact things that you're saying right now, is through taking care of yourself. And then taking care of yourself can be so many different things. But sleep, I think, is something that's so underrated that, people think, oh, 4 hours, I'll be fine. But that's not enough sleep.
No, it's not. And I'm awful if I don't get enough sleep. I'm distracted the whole day by how tired I am, which
Right.
pulls you out of the capacity for those moments that just might arrive unexpectedly,
Mm.
where well-being or happiness, you can step into that experience. So having some of these basic building blocks in place helps set the stage. It's like you're trying to build a fire, right? So you need the right materials, and you hope that if you put them all together, that flame will be sparked.
Mm-hmm. And how, if you are, and I know everyone is different, everyone's journey is different, everyone's circumstances are different, and perhaps the approach that you would take with different clients that you have in the work that you do is different for every single person because it is individualized. Now, if someone is just starting to uncover their traumatic situations in their life that may impact their overall well-being, or maybe they've lived with PTSD for years and years, or have had an event happen in their life that was very significant and sort of you know triggered all of these new different types of emotions within them. Where could someone start as a basic beginning to try and understand those different traumas and that different sort of how PTSD may show up through those different events? Does that make sense? Like, how would you even begin?
Well, that's a great question.
Thanks.
That's what I start. People start, as you said, in different places. It depends on your particular story. And, it's been said that a traumatic experience, that we're trapped in our memories of these experiences. And I talk in my book, Daddy, about my experiences of my parents' murder suicide.
Mm.
My father, when I was 28, shot my mother and then killed himself. I was in the house at the time. I didn't witness this, but I was the one who came upon their bodies and had to deal with the aftermath. And as a result, I developed PTSD. And my journey took many, many years, as most people's do. And for me, the entry point was therapy. I was lucky enough to be in therapy at the time that this happened. And I continued for many years after with, in the first several years, I don't feel like I got as much benefit as I would have liked, but maybe that's also a marker of just how deep in I was. And so I would say therapy is the best general entry point for people, but not everybody, I recognize, has the time, that they don't have the finances to be able to do that. And so I think that I can give you some good ideas. Maybe you can include some book ideas of entry points for talking about this experience. My book, I think, is really kind of like a Swiss Army knife, that I try to approach the experience of trauma and, from all the different entry points, from, a single horrible experience like I had, or the trauma of a lot of the cultural oppressions that people live with every day.
Mm-hmm.
And so this book, I really try to address different types of trauma and talk about my path through that and how other people might be able to use some of these ideas. And, outside of therapy, there's the basic building blocks of good self-care. But I think also something that really helped me so much in later years is mindfulness meditation, and being able to really manage strong feelings that arise when those memories circulate back again and again, or when the people experience trauma on a bodily level too, very profoundly. And so those physical symptoms can also be cues that, you're unsafe, the world is unsafe, and so people can really kind of hide away. I think isolation is really, for trauma survivors, the one of the biggest challenges that people don't talk about. And so something I didn't participate in, and I wish I had, was a support group. And there's many support groups out there for trauma survivors that are no cost, available online. So I think that's an important resource for people looking to take the first step in dealing with their trauma, and
Mm-hmm.
to develop, as I've been able to do, a really purposeful, meaning-driven life, which I want to add are, I think, critical pieces of a sustained sense of happiness, or meaning, a sense of meaning in life, and a feeling of purpose in your days.
Mm-hmm. I think that there's so much in there okay, I have 3 questions for you that came out of that. I actually had to grab my notebook and write them down because I didn't want to forget them, because I want to make sure I ask them. From that perspective, do you believe that the impacts of trauma ever actually end?
I think it's more, I was talking about it, people wishing for a light switch where they can just turn stuff off.
Yeah.
I think it's more an experience of like a dimmer switch, that dealing with it effectively means that the intensity is turned down. People never forget. You're never going to forget what happened. And you will find your mind kind of drifting to, losses, or the experience of the trauma, like I did with my parents so often. And so that's natural. And there's, a certain amount of grief, I think, that's always going to be attached to trauma, because there's been, it implies that there's been a loss, if not of a person, of a sense of trust in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And
That is genius, because that was actually my next question for you was,
so,
how did you begin to trust again? And so it's interesting that you went there without even me having to ask, because I think that piece of trust, what I've been learning over the last few years is a lot of the times when we feel that when we feel unsafe within ourselves and feel unsafe within our decisions and our lives, like, you and I, we don't really know each other. So I'll give you a very like quick story. I am someone who very much my entire life has played into what other people think is best for me. And so when you start to begin to uncover what you actually want for yourself, it causes a lot of chaos, I think, within other people because they're not used to being like that. But also what you realize is how much, of my own trauma and baggage that I had to start to unpack. And in that, didn't trust anybody. I couldn't even trust myself. So how do you start to find that trust again within yourself and then start to detach yourself and so essentially detach yourself from the story that you've created in your mind around that? Because I do believe you can detach, but it is very difficult to do.
it is, and it brings to mind something that accompanies trauma so often is what I we could generally call borderline personality disorder. That people, in an effort to bring others closer, will push them away because of the fear of abandonment. So often, trauma causes a deep, deep fear of a terror of abandonment, really, and so I think something that is so dialectical behavioral therapy for DBT, for
Mhm.
borderline personality disorder. I think they should teach that in elementary school. It is basic information about how to soothe yourself when you're feeling strong emotions, how to work through difficult problems. But I think particularly like you're describing in your situation, it's helpful to be able to help soothe yourself as you try to take on new task, break out of that sort of mold that you were describing. And so building trust in yourself and others, I think, is a very, very slow incremental process when it's been shattered, that trust. And so for me, I finally found a therapist that I really bonded with. And she really kind of represented a mother figure to me. And so I was able, having had a very close, loving relationship with my mother, was able to reignite that sense of a bond of trust over time with my therapist. And I think that what was also important is that I had isolated a lot and pushed a lot of people away, and so overcoming that tendency to pull up like a turtle in my shell. It took years, and I think something that really helped me a lot was going back to school.
Mm.
But I think everybody needs to find, ways in the beginning, especially of ways that feel a little bit safer to engage with the world, and over time build on that. Through my graduate school education, I was really able to access some, really dormant strengths, or some that I didn't even know about. Like I talked about, helping to nurture people, helping to move them to the next level. And so I think the trust has to be reestablished through experiences out there in the world. There's no replacement for experiences with other people, but especially with trauma or being trapped in kind of the mold like you're talking about in your own life, it can be a very fear-inducing experience to put yourself out there. But without making those changes incrementally and learning ways to soothe yourself when you're feeling overwhelmed as a result of taking that extra step, it's going to, the things are going to stay in place, are going to continue to cycle in the same sort of experiences.
Mm. Ooh, that for the first time in a very long time, that feels very validating. That feels very like I feel seen right now in this conversation, to be honest, which is which is really nice, because I think that it can be a very isolating experience. When you go through something, nobody else has gone through it in the same way as you have. No one else has experienced it in the same way as you have. And, even with the, the trauma that you experienced between your parents, other people would have lived that also with you, but not in the same way as you. And that's
Mhm.
such a key distinction. And so when you are, you had recommended finding, a support group and stuff like that in different areas or whatever it is that specifically that that you're dealing with. But what if you don't feel like your situation quite fits the mold of being sort of deserving of being in a spot for like a PTSD group when, you think about PTSD and it's the people who've, gone to war or, have had like a very, very like traumatic, I guess it's like in some ways we can downplay our own trauma and downplay our own experience.
I get that exactly. Shortly after this happened was when O.J. Simpson killed his wife, Nicole Brown,
Oh,
and Ronald
wow.
Goldman. And so here was, suddenly this case of a husband murdering his wife. But I felt no parallels. I did not feel more understood as a result of that.
Oh.
In the beginning, I told people about it all the time, and then I could see the reactions and I felt more isolated. And so I kind of kept it somewhat of a secret for a while. But it can be very difficult, as you say, to not see models out there of what you've been through, an exact match, and that's further isolating. And so I think you have to also try to, as best you can, to adjust your expectations. That, I think there's, infinite numbers of trauma, but there's certain themes that hold. And so I would suggest, if you're feeling, like your trauma is not as important as, somebody who experienced, trauma fighting in Afghanistan, for example, to really try to take a second look at that. People who have been through trauma and are in a support group are not there to judge other people. They're thinking about what they've been through. I think that's this important piece, is that maybe, yeah, if you're feeling like there's not a good match, like maybe you'll be judged as, your problems are, trivial in comparison. I hear that a lot in my work. People will tell me terrible things and they'll say, what, but look at what's going on in Gaza,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I shouldn't be unhappy. I should be doing just fine. I have everything going for me, but yet I'm still not happy, or I'm still suffering with these traumatic memories.
Mm-hmm. That's so true. And it's that invalidating of your own experience in order to, I don't know why we do that. Maybe we do that to like, you know, show or share that, we are aware of all the things we have to be grateful for and how lucky we are in some respect. But I also think that can downplay a lot of the experiences that we have that have formed who we are.
Right. I think it summed up, it's become kind of popular to say first world problems
Yeah.
these days, right? Which I think it's true. We would not be faring very well in Gaza right now, or Israel for that matter. But we have our individual context and our subjective experience. That's all we have.
Right.
And our problems are very significant to us. I mean, that's part of being human, is that, it's a completely subjective experience in these situations of our emotions, our difficult experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think everybody needs to take a second look at this too, that, to be grateful that we have, security and food, and, for example, or at least I hope everybody, not everybody in this country does have
Yeah.
those things, but many of us do. And so to be grateful for certain things in our lives, but also honor, the reality of our own struggles.
Ooh, I really like that. That's beautiful. And with your book, it is coming out November 7th. So by the time this episode airs, it'll already be out. And I want to know, you've written this book, and I know there's gonna be a lot of key takeaways within the stories that you're going to share. The book is called Daddy, which you've already mentioned. The link is in the show notes below so people can grab their copy there. I want to know one key takeaway that you're hoping someone reading will take with them after reading the book.
Okay. Well, that's hard to narrow down.
Or a couple.
That the experience of trauma is very isolating. And if you have someone in your life who's experienced trauma, they may do things that seem very self-sabotaging, but the greater purpose of this book is to help people and those who are living around them, people who've experienced trauma, to overcome that sense of isolation. Maybe they can see themselves a bit in my story, and maybe there's a bit of hope and some concrete suggestions about how to deal or to begin to deal with their own experiences. That would be my greatest hope.
Beautiful. Amazing. And I want to ask you, this is the final question for you. And it's a question that I've asked on my podcast since I started it. And everyone always has a different answer. I'm excited to hear what yours is going to be. And it is, what is one way our listener today could create a little more happiness in their day, every day, starting today?
I think one way would be one way. It's so hard. Okay.
I know. I'm really narrowing it down today, huh?
I thought of something and then I started thinking of a list of other things. And this may sound trivial, but I would say get out and move, walk in nature if that's possible. I think cultivating a sense of awe and gratitude in the everyday can bring a lot of happiness and increase your sense of well-being. Notice the small things, the hot shower, maybe a good cup of coffee like I have right here. Pay attention to that. Try to have some gratitude for the everyday.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Dr. Tim, for joining me here today and for sharing all of your insight and about your new book and all of the work that you've been doing. This has been very validating for my own self. I know it's validating for my listener right now too. And yeah, just very grateful for you. So thank you.
Oh, I've been so happy to talk with you. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you. And thank you so much for listening to today's episode on the Happiness Happens podcast. I so appreciate your time with us today. Be sure to connect with both of us. Grab Dr. Tim's book. The link is in the show notes below. I hope you have a beautiful day today. And remember that happiness happens when you're least expecting it.